Top 3 bands Phil Collins hated. Philip Collins is an English musician, singer, songwriter, record producer, and actor. He rose to fame in the music world in the 1970s and 80s both for his work with the rock band Genesis and for his pop solo career. He was the drummer and later became the lead singer of the rock band Genesis. They influenced countless generations of artists in the following decades. He became one of the most successful pop and adult contemporary singers of the 80s and beyond. He also became known for a distinctive gated reverb drum sound on many of his recordings. Collins made his debut solo album, Face Value, in 1981, which turned out to be a bigger hit than any Genesis album. His music became synonymous with the pop-rock movement of the decade, initially inspired by his marital breakdown and love of soul music. Phil Collins has openly discussed the bands and musicians that inspired him throughout his career with Genesis and as a solo artist. However, Collins hasn't been hesitant to express his opinions on other artists, and there are several bands and musicians he's publicly criticized over the years. Here are 3 bands that Phil Collins hated the most. Oasis. While Oasis dominated the Britpop scene in the 90s, Phil Collins wasn't shy about voicing his dislike for them. The rivalry between the Gallagher brothers was often a media spectacle, but Collins thought their music was overrated. Noel and Liam Gallagher have consistently criticized former Genesis singer and drummer Phil Collins, often labeling him as boring. Though Collins initially chose to stay above the fray, he eventually expressed his frustration with Noel, stating that Oasis lacked significant talent and that he couldn't understand why they were viewed as rock stars. Genesis was already up against the wall when the first punk wave hit, but just when Collins entered his elder statesman phase, Oasis was the next generation of punks looking to tear down his more pretentious track record. Noel called him the Antichrist during a handful of interviews. When Collins did get word of it, he was less than thrilled about being dragged through the mud by the Britpop icon, saying on television later, "They're just horrible guys. They're rude and not as talented as they think they are. They keep having a go at me, which I find strange." While Collins admitted to appreciating their music, he said their attitude was the real issue for him. Led Zeppelin. The tensions between Phil Collins and Led Zeppelin reached a breaking point during their performance at Live Aid in 1985. Led Zeppelin had disbanded after the tragic death of John Bonham in 1980, and when the band was asked to reunite for Live Aid, Collins was invited to fill in on drums. Phil Collins has described his 1985 appearance with Led Zeppelin at Live Aid a disaster, and says he would have walked off if he thought he'd have got away with it. He admits to realizing this is a mistake almost as soon as the band started playing. "You could sense I wasn't welcomed, and Tony was not making life easy," he recalls. "If I could have walked off, I would have done. But then we'd all be talking about why Phil Collins walked off Live Aid, so I just stuck it out. It was a disaster." Collins has described the experience as a disaster. He wasn't properly rehearsed, the sound was terrible, and he felt the band wasn't cohesive. But what really stung was the post-show criticism from Zeppelin members, particularly Jimmy Page, who blamed Collins for the underwhelming performance. Phil didn't hold back when talking about it later, saying he felt thrown under the bus by the band. Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd was known for their sprawling concept albums, pushing the boundaries of rock with albums like The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. Their progressive, experimental sound stood in stark contrast to the more mainstream, radio-friendly hits that Collins was pumping out. Phil Collins was never particularly impressed by Pink Floyd, despite their status as pioneers of British psychedelic rock. Collins mentioned in a 2014 interview with John Edgerton that, while he was a big fan of early Yes, he didn't connect with much of their later work. He also wasn't a fan of Pink Floyd during their early years, although he did say he appreciated their music more as time went on. Despite having seen them live at the Marquee during the Arnold Layne era, Collins explained that he didn't feel Genesis was in the same category as other bands like Pink Floyd. Roger Waters, one of Pink Floyd's key songwriters, also didn't think highly of Collins, especially during the 1980s and early 90s. In a 1992 interview with Musician magazine, Waters criticized Collins, accusing him of pretending to be a songwriter and a rock and roller, and said that Collins represented much of what was wrong with the music scene at the time.